Welcome back, guys. We have been hard at work on the Ferrari lately, making a ton of progress. I've been having a blast. I don't even want to pump the brakes on this thing, but I feel like I should try to make some progress on the Model A. It's been sitting for a minute now, and after all, we were this close to having the entire project completely finished until some idiot went and wrecked this thing, and now we got to fix it. Now, I've broken this build down into 4 major parts in my head, and we've already finished the first one, and that's designing and building all of the suspension mounts for this thing. Today, I want to build the chassis rails that those suspension mounts attach to. Part 3 is attaching all of that stuff to the existing Model A chassis, and then we got to build some control arms, and I am a pro at that now, let me tell you. So I'm not too worried about this, so I think today we have a pretty good chance of crossing the halfway point for this build, and I think it's probably the more difficult half. So let me stop talking about it, and let's go see how far we can get.
Did you expect this episode to start out with a dirty old transmission? No? Well, it does. My weekend was spent right here on the workbench trying to repair this absolutely destroyed bell housing. It broke into 2 pieces, but I did manage to get it put back together, and I'm pretty happy with the outcome, given the fact that this is dirty, old, greasy, cast aluminum that has spent the last 25 years underneath a diesel truck. But I did hit one major snag during this repair. You see, this is my TIG torch, and despite being water-cooled, water's definitely not supposed to come out of the end of the cup. In fact, it makes it really hard to weld aluminum when you're pouring water directly into the weld. So this hampered pretty much all of the rest of the progress of the weekend, and I had to wait until Monday to get a new one. But that won't stop us from getting out some of the other tools and still making at least a little bit of progress. So I got out the old miter saw that's definitely not meant for metal, and we're going to put it to work cutting this 3x2 inch 120 wall chassis material. This stuff is definitely overkill for a 2,200 pound hot rod, but that's probably why it survived the accident as well as it did. As for what we're building today, it's the chassis rails that I have highlighted here. We drew these up in a previous episode, and now it's time to translate their dimensions to real life. We're using the miter saw to cut these 34.2 degree angles where each tube meets. We've got fish plates we can use to easily find that angle, but even without them, it's as simple as using a digital angle finder. For a miter cut that totals 34.2 degrees, we're going to cut that number in half and dial the saw in to 17.1, which is buried somewhere down in there below the metal dust. These bonded chop saw blades definitely aren't the best tool for the job, but they're a lot cheaper than a really nice metal cutting blade, and I don't use this thing often enough to justify the price difference. With everything cut up, there's still a decent bit of cleanup to do. All of these edges need their flashing removed, and we need to bevel the edges where all of the tubes meet so we can get maximum weld penetration. I know some of you guys have been asking about why I use a grinder with no guard on it, and we're going to touch upon that at the end of the episode. With our edges beveled, there's one step left, and that's to remove the dark gray mill scale from the outside of the steel, because TIG welding through this stuff is simply not an option. Removing the mill scale can be an arduous process, but the best tool that I've found for this job are these deburring wheels for a die grinder. And they're not cheap, but I've yet to find anything else that is quite as effective as these are. With the mill scale removed, we're ready to weld this stuff up, and the timing is pretty perfect because on Monday I was able to score a new TIG torch. But that does mean swapping over all of the hoses and the hose cover. So let's knock that out. This process is definitely time-consuming because I opt for a 25-foot lead on my TIG torch, so I can use the welder anywhere in this shop. But after getting everything laid out and all the hoses untangled, we're ready to wrap this thing up and install it. And now we're ready to weld things once again. I've replaced the torch with the same one I had previously, a CK20 Flex Head. And this thing is really useful for positioning it however you may want. And that's been really helpful as a beginner TIG welder. But I have to imagine it's useful no matter what your skill level is. With all of that out of the way, it's finally time to start sticking some metal together. I'm clamping all of our material down to the flat tabletop so nothing moves or warps, because flatness and trueness are paramount for this build. Even with the clamps, things can move. So I want to tack one side of this together and then flip it over and re-clamp it in an effort to prevent warping. With 3 sides welded up, I'm grinding down the outside weld smooth so that we can flip this part over and clamp it to the table and ensure that once again it's totally flat. For the TIG welders out there, I'm burning this stuff in at 120 amps, which as always matches my material thickness and seemed to be just the right setting to get a nice flat weld profile. Now, I don't advocate for grinding down welds unless you absolutely have to in order for part fitment. And in this case, we need to get our fish plates seated nicely. So let's quickly talk about what those fish plates are actually going to do. These may look like added decoration, but they're a structural member. Because we've got a miter cut here that is welded together, it's not necessarily the strongest connection. But by adding a thick plate to the outside of the joint and completely welding its perimeter, we can effectively strengthen this joint significantly. And because we have a nice laser cut part, we can make it look pretty cool while we're at it. We're only going to be fish plating one side of this chassis rail at the moment, but I have enough to do both sides of every joint, and I imagine we're going to add the rest of them further down the line. As far as the welding process goes, I tried a lot of different techniques because I really wanted these to look good, and I'm happy with them for the most part, although there is a bit of inconsistency I'd like to work on in the long term. In any case though, these frame rails are done and we're ready to attach them to the cross member. As nice as it would be to just slide these frame rails into place and weld this thing up, there's a lot of measuring to do. Now begins the challenge of making sure everything is square and true. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to setting this up, and there's no real way to shortcut any of it. So it's a long, laborious process of setting up a jig. Let me show you guys how this one works. Now, I already know none of this is going to make sense unless you're really paying attention, but I want to show how I've pulled this off. For starters, we've got our Certiflat weld table, so I know that the surface of this is flat, and I know that the sides of it are perpendicular to it. This is perfectly square. I've got both halves of Jason's Magic Square from Fireball Tool clamped to the table, one to this face to give me a perfectly inline face with that, and then the other clamped to the top of the table and to this face of the square to give me an extended face. And we've got the frame rail itself clamped to all of these surfaces. So we've got it clamped down to the side of the table down here and to this face of the Magic Square. So I know it's all square and true with the side of the table. And then we've got our cross member clamped to the table and to the side face of the Magic Square. So I know they're perpendicular with each other. And then the other half of the Magic Square is helping us confirm that. Everything lines up, mates up, and looks really nice. We've got the level here. It just turned off, but it confirms that the angle of the frame rail is flat with the angle of the table, because technically this frame rail can sit in there and kind of do this number. So everything should be square and true. I'm happy with it. It's complicated, but it definitely is putting this fixture table to use. So let's put some tacks on it. First came the tacks, and then I fully welded the cross member into place. I figured it was important to do while I had everything jigged up and clamped, as I don't want to try to set this up a second time after I've tacked everything together. As said before, there's a lot of measuring when it comes to setting this up. This is definitely a measure twice and cut once scenario because there's no real chance to do this a second time. I'm using my 1, 2, 3 blocks and pretty much every square I've got to make sure everything on this chassis is perpendicular. Now for the time being, I've decided to only tack the upper control arm and coilover mounts into place. For the sake of progress on the episode, I'm going to save the welding for the next one. But getting to take a step back and look at the progress, this thing's really coming together, and I'm pretty confident in saying this one is a lot better built than the first rendition of this truck. Now, before we run over the final details and cap the progress for today, let's talk about that angle grinder I mentioned previously. So I'm addressing this because you guys make a lot of comments about it, and I think I owe it to you to at least say something about it. Why do I run grinders with no guard on them? Because I think they're useless otherwise. Is that a safe answer? Nope. I know that it's not. I'm not even advocating for running no guard. You should leave your guard on. It's definitely smarter. But I've got hundreds, if not thousands of hours of use with angle grinders, and the only times I've ever had a disc explode is from misuse. These flimsy little discs are cantankerous, and they will blow up the second you don't respect them. You cannot lean on the grinder. You cannot put torque or side load. You have to respect the cutoff wheel. In fact, I have hundreds of these things here in the shop. I buy them in bulk, and anytime I use one and I don't know exactly what I cut with it last time, I toss it out. This wheel on this grinder, it doesn't look perfect. I toss it out. Is that playing it overly cautious? Maybe, but I run my cutoff wheels without a guard, so I'm gonna play it a little bit more safe. But I like the versatility of the tool and the function of the tool without the guard on it. Now, I also know this is gonna be the clip everybody links to further down the line when I have one of these eventually explode and stick itself in my face or in my neck. In fact, I've had people comment on my videos saying they hope that does happen and then I bleed out on the shop floor because I'm setting such a bad example. You guys are crazy. But, you know what? This is how I use the tool. It's how I've always used the tool. It's dangerous. It's a level of danger I accept. So don't do this unless you accept the level of danger that it presents. And it is very dangerous. It is not smart. Be very careful if you do this. But that's why I do it. This tool is incredibly useful and much more versatile without the guard on it. You can do a lot more things with it, but you have to be responsible. So be responsible. So everything here is all tacked together, and I feel really good about it being square and true. And that's the most important part of any of this, especially it being suspension. This has taken a lot longer to get to this point than I thought that it would, just because there are so many little variables and things I've had to measure and double, triple check, and clamps just making everything as square as I can. But I'm happy with it. I just got to figure out what to do with the front lower control arm mount. Initially, I was going to offset it forward, but a lot of people that I trust have told me that moving that forward, moving the rack forward, isn't going to net me what I think that it will. And I need to focus more on the up and down vertical height of the steering rack or of the tie rod ends in order to correct my bump steer. And I don't know everything. I wing it a lot of the time. So I'm going to trust them, and I think instead I'm going to line up that lower control arm mount with the upper one like it was before. But I'm not going to be able to get that done today. There's just not enough time, and I don't want to rush things just to have kind of a finished product in an episode. I know you guys would probably love that, but I don't want to shortcut what the vehicle should be. I don't want to rush something and make a bad decision, a bad call, get something out of square, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just going to pause here. I need to stop here, appreciate what I have gotten done, and maybe come up with some ideas on how to jig the rest of this up. I want it to all be as good as I can possibly make it. I think I've done pretty well so far. I know there's a few people out there that probably really know what they're doing that are saying, dude, you did it all wrong. I'd be curious what like my buddy Kyle Kuhnhausen, who does this shit all the time, would say, but I don't know. I think we're good. I think it's working out. Is it perfect? Who knows, but it's probably good enough. Good enough for who it's for. So with that said, I'm gonna cut this one off. I will say I am working on some merchandise. You guys have been asking about it. I've been saying I've been working on it, but I've got something in the works finally. My buddy Andrew's helping me out. My buddy Mike's doing some stuff. Got some other people working on some stuff. It's finally coming together. It's just hard to put together 2 episodes every week and also work on apparel outside of that. But it's happening. So those of you that want it, it's coming. Just be patient with me and we'll get there. I'm gonna give first dibs to anybody that's on the Patreon. So if you want first access before anything sells out, get it there. And with that said, I appreciate the support. I'll catch you guys at the end of the week. I don't know what we're gonna be working on. I gotta figure it out. I haven't planned that far ahead, but I will see you then and we'll work on something fun.